Welcome back to True Stories of Humility. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from today. Now let's dive into a story that reminds us why we should never judge a book by its cover. In the polished halls of a prestigious policy institute in Washington, D.C., where power brokers and political elites gathered to shape the nation's future, an unexpected confrontation was about to unfold. A man in a simple navy suit, carrying a weathered leather briefcase, made his way through the marble-floored lobby. His appearance was understated, lacking the typical flashiness of Washington insiders, but there was an unmistakable quiet confidence in his stride. J.D. Vance had arrived early for the Economic Policy Forum, preferring to observe the room before his scheduled speaking engagement. As he settled into a corner seat, pulling out his notebook to review his talking points, he couldn't help but overhear the conversations around him. The air was thick with discussions about economic inequality, rural development, and the future of American industry, topics that were deeply personal to him. A group of well-dressed consultants nearby were engaged in animated discussion about the rural problem in America. Their voices carried across the room, filled with the kind of academic certainty that comes from studying spreadsheets rather than living experiences. Among them, a man in an expensive tailored suit, Marcus Henderson, seemed particularly vocal about his theories. "These people just don't understand how the modern economy works," Marcus declared, his voice carrying an edge of condescension. "They cling to outdated industries and wonder why opportunity passes them by." His colleagues nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of amusement and false sympathy. J.D. continued writing in his notebook, but his pen paused momentarily at the familiar rhetoric. He'd heard similar sentiments throughout his journey from the hills of Ohio to the halls of Yale Law School. The same dismissive attitude that had fueled his determination to bridge the growing divide in American society. Marcus, noticing J.D.'s simple attire and quiet demeanor, assumed he'd found an easy target for his pontification. "You there?" he called out, gesturing toward J.D. with his half-empty coffee cup. "You look like you might have some first-hand experience with these issues. Tell me, why do people in rural areas resist progress?" The room grew quieter as others turned to observe the interaction. J.D. looked up from his notebook, his expression remaining neutral despite the obvious condescension in Marcus's tone. Before he could respond, Marcus continued, "People like you don't belong in places like this unless you're willing to admit that the old ways are dead." What Marcus didn't realize was that the quiet man he'd chosen to patronize had not only lived the very experiences he was theorizing about, but had also become one of the most insightful voices on the subject. J.D. had transformed his challenging upbringing in the Rust Belt into fuel for understanding the complex social and economic issues facing America's forgotten communities. The tension in the room was palpable as other attendees began to recognize who Marcus was actually addressing. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others watched with growing interest. The stage was set for a moment that would remind everyone present about the danger of making assumptions and the importance of genuine understanding over superficial judgment. As J.D. closed his notebook and rose to his feet, the weight of his experiences, from his childhood in Middletown, Ohio, to his service in the Marine Corps, to his time at Yale, seemed to fill the space around him. His response would soon make Marcus wish he'd never opened his mouth and teach everyone present a valuable lesson about respect, understanding, and the true meaning of progress in modern America. The tension in the Policy Institute's conference room crackled like static electricity before a storm. J.D. stood with the kind of composure that comes not from privilege, but from facing and overcoming real adversity. His calm demeanor seemed to irritate Marcus even more, like water droplets hitting hot oil. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. The same floors that had been polished to perfection by workers who, ironically, probably came from the very communities Marcus had been dismissing. The room had fallen into an anticipatory silence, broken only by the gentle hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of traffic from the capital. Marcus, apparently emboldened by his colleagues' previous encouraging nods, continued his verbal assault. "Look, I've studied these issues extensively," he declared, adjusting his gold cufflinks with practiced precision. "The problem with rural America is simple, a failure to adapt. I've written several papers on the subject." He gestured to his leather briefcase, packed with documents that analyzed people's lives through the cold lens of statistics and theoretical frameworks. JD's response was measured, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience rather than academic theory. "Interesting perspective," he began, his words cutting through the tension like a well-honed blade. "Tell me, when was the last time you actually visited these communities you've written so extensively about?" Marcus's confidence wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "I don't need to visit to understand the data. The numbers don't lie." He pulled out a glossy report from his briefcase, waving it as if it were irrefutable evidence. Unemployment rates, education statistics, economic indicators, they tell the whole story. The crowd of policy wonks and think tank researchers had grown larger now, forming a loose circle around the two men. Among them, Dr. Sarah Chen, a respected economist, watched with particular interest. She'd read JD's work and recognized him immediately, but chose to remain silent, curious to see how this encounter would unfold. "Numbers can tell many stories," JD replied, "depending on who's doing the telling." He gestured toward the report, in Marcus's hand, "But they can't tell you about the single mother working 3 jobs to keep her kids in school. They can't tell you about the factory worker retraining for the 3rd time as industries evolve. They can't tell you about the community leaders fighting every day to build a better future." Marcus scoffed, his designer shoes squeaking on the marble floor as he took a step forward. "Sentimentality doesn't drive progress. These people need to accept that their way of life is obsolete. People like you should understand that better than anyone." His words dripped with condescension, each syllable revealing his deeply entrenched biases. The room had grown so quiet you could hear the gentle clink of coffee cups being set down as people abandoned their morning rituals to watch the exchange. Even the usually bustling catering staff had paused their preparations for the upcoming conference. "People like me," JD echoed, his voice carrying a hint of amusement that seemed to unsettle Marcus. "Please, elaborate on what you mean by that." Marcus, now fully committed to his position, gestured dismissively at JD's simple attire. "Look, it's admirable that you've made it into this building, but some of us have spent years developing expertise in economic development and social policy. We understand the bigger picture." What Marcus didn't realize was that with each word, he was digging himself deeper into a hole that would soon swallow his presumptions whole. The bigger picture he claimed to understand was about to expand dramatically. Dr. Chen had pulled out her phone, discreetly typing something to her colleagues. Several other attendees were doing the same, their messages creating a silent ripple of awareness through the crowd. The story of what was unfolding would soon spread through Washington's policy circles like wildfire. JD maintained his composed stance, years of Marine Corps discipline evident in his bearing. "The bigger picture," he began, "often looks very different from ground level than it does from an ivory tower. When you've lived through the challenges you're theorizing about, when you've watched your community struggle with economic transformation, when you've had to navigate the very systems you're analyzing, that's when you start to understand the real complexity of these issues." Marcus's colleagues had begun to shift uncomfortably, some trying to catch his eye and signal him to stop. But he was too invested in his position to notice their discomfort. "That's exactly the kind of emotional argument that holds back progress," he declared. "We need objective, data-driven solutions, not anecdotes from—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Well-meaning amateurs." The irony of his statement hung in the air like heavy smoke. Several people in the crowd exchanged knowing looks, while others watched with a mixture of embarrassment and anticipation. The conference room had become an impromptu theater, staging a drama about presumption, privilege, and the dangerous gap between academic theory and lived reality. A young intern, unable to contain herself any longer, whispered something to her supervisor. The whisper carried just far enough for Marcus to catch fragments about bestseller and Yale law. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but he quickly dismissed it. After all, he reasoned, how could someone who looked so ordinary, someone who spoke about rural communities with such familiarity, possibly be who these whispers suggested? JD noticed the subtle shift in Marcus's expression and recognized the moment was right to begin dismantling the wall of assumptions his opponent had built. He reached into his worn leather briefcase, not for academic papers or statistical reports, but for something that would soon transform the entire dynamic of their encounter. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays illuminating dust motes in the air between the two men. These particles danced like visual representations of the tension floating between them, between theory and practice, between assumption and reality, between inherited privilege and earned wisdom. The stage was set for a revelation that would leave an indelible mark on everyone present, especially Marcus, who was about to learn a valuable lesson about judging books by their covers. The conference room had become an arena of silent anticipation as JD reached into his briefcase. Instead of pulling out a document, he carefully placed his visitor's badge on the polished mahogany table. The badge hadn't been necessary. He wasn't a visitor at all. He was, in fact, the morning's keynote speaker. Dr. Chen chose this moment to step forward, her heels clicking purposefully on the marble floor. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice carrying the authority of her position as the Institute's research director. "I believe you're familiar with Hillbilly Elegy, the new York Times bestseller that transformed our understanding of rural American socioeconomic challenges." The color began to drain from Marcus's face as the pieces started falling into place. His colleagues, who had been quietly trying to signal him earlier, now stood in uncomfortable silence. The report he had been wielding so confidently began to feel heavy in his hands, particularly because it contained several citations from the very man he had been lecturing. "I've written several papers analyzing that book," Marcus managed to say, his voice losing its previous bravado. "It's a cornerstone text in modern social mobility studies." The irony of his statement hung in the air like a heavy fog. JD's smile remained gentle, but took on a new dimension. "I'm glad you found it insightful," he replied. "I wrote it based on exactly the kind of first-hand experiences you seemed so quick to dismiss earlier." The revelation rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Those who hadn't already recognized JD now whispered his full credentials to their neighbors: Yale Law School graduate, Marine Corps veteran, successful venture capitalist, best-selling author, and one of the most influential voices in contemporary American social policy. Marcus stood frozen, his expensive suit suddenly feeling too tight around the collar. The same papers he had been brandishing now trembled slightly in his hands. His eyes darted to the conference agenda lying on a nearby table, where J.D. Vance's name was prominently displayed as the keynote speaker. I didn't," Marcus stammered, but J.D. raised a hand, not to silence him, but to offer understanding. "You didn't know who I was," J.D. completed the thought. "And that's exactly the point I'd like to address. He gestured to the room at large, including everyone in the conversation. We often make assumptions about people based on appearances, don't we? About their experiences, their knowledge, their worth. The morning sunlight now streamed fully through the windows, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. Among the audience, phones had disappeared back into pockets. This was a moment that demanded full attention, a real-life lesson unfolding before their eyes. "You see, Marcus," JD continued, his voice carrying no trace of triumph or mockery, "the papers you're holding, the statistics, the theories, the academic frameworks, they're important, but they're tools for understanding, not substitutes for genuine engagement with the communities we're discussing." Dr. Chen nodded appreciatively, recognizing the teaching moment. "Perhaps this is exactly the kind of dialogue we need to be having at today's conference," she suggested, skillfully transforming an awkward confrontation into a learning opportunity. Marcus's colleagues had begun to distance themselves subtly, both physically and metaphorically, from his earlier pronounced statements. Among them, a young analyst named Rachel Torres found the courage to speak up. "Mr. Vance," she began, "your book actually inspired me to conduct field research in rural communities, instead of relying solely on data analysis." JD acknowledged her comment with a warm smile. "That's exactly the kind of bridge building we need," he said. "The strongest solutions come from combining rigorous analysis with genuine understanding of lived experiences." The tension in the room had transformed into something different, an atmosphere of reflection and reconsideration. Even those who had initially smirked at Marcus's confrontational approach were now engaged in quiet self-examination of their own biases. Marcus, still visibly shaken but beginning to recover his professional composure, cleared his throat. "Mr. Vance, I owe you an apology," he began, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. "My comments were not only inappropriate, but fundamentally flawed in their assumptions." JD approached him, closing the physical distance that had separated them during their confrontation. "Apology accepted," he said, extending his hand. "But let's use this moment to discuss something more important than personal embarrassment." The room seemed to lean in collectively as JD continued. "The divide we're trying to bridge isn't just economic or social. It's a divide in understanding. When we dismiss experiences we haven't lived, when we reduce complex human stories to data points, we miss the very insights that could lead to real solutions." Dr. Chen seized the opportunity to advance the discussion. "Perhaps, Mr. Vance, you could share your thoughts on how we might better integrate qualitative experiences with quantitative analysis in our policy work." The morning's unexpected confrontation had transformed into an impromptu seminar, with JD leading a discussion that would have been impossible just moments before. Even Marcus, having moved past his initial embarrassment, found himself taking notes, this time with a different kind of attention, one born of humility and genuine desire to learn. As the official start time for the conference approached, more attendees filtered into the room, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. They found not the typical pre-conference networking scene, but an engaged group deep in meaningful discussion about methodology, respect, and the importance of combining academic rigor with real-world understanding. The incident would be talked about in policy circles for months to come, not for the embarrassment of Marcus's mistake, but for the way it crystallized a crucial lesson about presumption and perspective in policy work. Some would later say it was the most valuable session of the entire conference, though it appeared nowhere on the official agenda. JD's keynote speech later that morning would build on this unexpected prelude, but the real impact had already been made in those unscripted moments. The Policy Institute's marble halls had witnessed not just a confrontation between two individuals, but a collision between different ways of seeing and understanding the world, and the possibility of bridging that divide through mutual respect and genuine dialogue. The story of what happened that morning at the Policy Institute quickly became legend in Washington's professional circles, but its real impact went far beyond the capital's gossip mill. As the conference proceeded through its scheduled agenda, the morning's unexpected encounter cast a subtle but significant shadow over every presentation and panel discussion. JD's keynote speech, delivered an hour after the confrontation, took on additional weight given the context. As he stood at the podium, those who had witnessed the earlier exchange noticed how he had maintained the same unpretentious demeanor, neither elevated by his triumph nor diminished by the morning's tension. The simple navy suit that Marcus had dismissed now seemed to represent something more, a conscious choice to remain connected to the communities he spoke about. Understanding America's challenges requires more than data, JD began his address, seamlessly weaving the morning's incident into his prepared remarks. It requires us to challenge our assumptions, to step outside our comfort zones, and most importantly, to listen to voices we might otherwise ignore. In the third row, Marcus sat with a new perspective, his notebook open, his expensive pen moving across the page with purpose. The same hands that had wielded reports as weapons now recorded insights with humility. His colleagues noticed the change. Gone was the dismissive smirk, replaced by an expression of genuine concentration. During the lunch break, conversations in the Institute's elegant dining room buzzed with discussion of both the morning's drama and its larger implications. Dr. Chen, who had helped transform the confrontation into a teaching moment, found herself at a table with several young analysts, including Rachel Torres, who had spoken up earlier. What struck me most, Rachel shared, picking at her salad, was how Mr. Vance turned what could have been a moment of humiliation into an opportunity for collective learning. Others at the table nodded, their own experiences with professional humility and growth bubbling to the surface. At a corner table, Marcus sat with Dr. William Foster, a veteran policy researcher who had mentored many of the Institute's leading voices. "You know," Dr. Foster said, his voice carrying decades of experience, "I made a similar mistake early in my career. Thought I understood poverty because I'd studied it. It took an encounter much like yours to show me the difference between knowing about something and understanding it." Marcus looked up from his barely touched lunch. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about all the communities I've written about but never visited. All the conclusions I've drawn from data without context." His words carried the weight of genuine self-reflection. As the afternoon sessions began, the conference had taken on a different character. Presenters who had planned to rely solely on PowerPoint slides and statistical analyses found themselves adding personal anecdotes and real-world examples. The questions from the audience became less about methodology and more about practical implementation and community impact. JD spent the afternoon moving through the conference, not as a celebrity author or distinguished speaker, but as a bridge between worlds, academic and practical, theoretical and lived experience. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did contribute to discussions, his words carried the dual authority of scholarly rigor and personal authenticity. During one particularly powerful panel discussion on rural economic development, a young economist from a prestigious think tank raised her hand. "This morning's incident," she began carefully, "made me realize that my entire research methodology might be flawed. I've been studying communities from a distance, thinking objectivity meant detachment. But what if true objectivity requires engagement?" The question sparked a deeper conversation about research methods and community involvement. Even Marcus, who had initially shrunk from participation after the morning's events, found the courage to contribute. "Perhaps," he suggested, his voice carrying new humility, "we need to rethink what expertise means in our field." As the afternoon wore on, the story of the morning's encounter began spreading beyond the conference walls. Social media posts from attendees hinted at a transformative moment in policy discourse. One tweet read, "Watching real change happen in real time at the Policy Institute today. Sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't on the agenda." By the day's final session, the conference had evolved into something its organizers hadn't planned, but desperately needed: a forum for honest discussion about the gap between policy theory and lived reality. The marble halls that had witnessed the morning's confrontation now echoed with conversations about bridge building and authentic engagement. Dr. Chen, closing the final panel, addressed the elephant in the room directly. "Today we witnessed something remarkable," she said. "We saw how a moment of confrontation can become a catalyst for change, but the real test will be what we do tomorrow and the day after that." As attendees began gathering their materials and saying their goodbyes, Marcus approached JD one final time. The two men stood near the same spot where their confrontation had begun that morning, but the dynamic had shifted entirely. "Mr. Vance," Marcus began, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort, "I've been thinking about how to make this right, not just with an apology, but with actions." He pulled out a well-worn copy of Hillbilly Elegy from his briefcase, one that, despite his earlier claims, looked like it had never been opened. "Would you sign this? Not as a courtesy, but as a commitment. I'm going to read it properly this time, and then I'm going to visit some of the communities I've been writing about." JD took the book with a warm smile. "Call me JD," he said, pulling out his pen. As he signed, he added a note: "The best expertise comes from both study and experience. Looking forward to hearing about your journey." The Policy Institute's cleaning staff arrived to find small groups still deep in conversation, reluctant to let go of the day's energy. Dr. Chen had already scheduled a follow-up meeting to discuss revising the Institute's research protocols. Rachel Torres was organizing a working group to develop new community engagement guidelines. As JD finally prepared to leave, gathering his worn briefcase and simple coat, he overheard snippets of conversation that suggested the day's impact would outlast its duration. Researchers discussing field visits, analysts planning community consultations, policy writers talking about incorporating lived experiences into their recommendations. The Washington evening was settling in, the Capitol's monuments lighting up against the darkening sky. As JD stepped out into the cool air, he reflected on how a moment of confrontation had transformed into an opportunity for change. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and media requests for interviews about the day's events, but those could wait. What mattered was that somewhere in that building, people were rethinking their approaches, questioning their assumptions, and considering new ways to bridge the gap between theory and reality. The marble halls that had witnessed one man's humbling would now host conversations that might actually lead to better understanding and more effective policies. As our story draws to a close, let's remember that expertise comes in many forms, and wisdom often appears in unexpected packages. The next time you're tempted to judge someone based on appearances or dismiss experiences different from your own, remember what happened in those polished halls of power. For those watching this video, we'd love to hear your stories. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever learned an important lesson about judging others too quickly? Share your experiences in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us why humility and respect should guide our interactions with others. Remember, true understanding requires both knowledge and empathy. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from the books we read or the data we analyze, but from the moments when we're willing to admit we might be wrong and brave enough to learn from those we too quickly dismissed. This is True Stories of Humility, reminding you that every person you meet has a story worth hearing, and wisdom often comes from the most unexpected sources. Until next time, keep your minds open and your hearts ready to learn.